I have begun to digitize my family slides because I have not experienced nearly enough tedium and mind-numbing repetition in my life, which is how I discovered myself transported to the Lyndon Johnson first term, round about 8 months after the Kennedy assassination and 5 months after Ed Sullivan introduced the Beatles, in the days when my social circle was switching to banana seats with high handlebars to facilitate wheelies. It was then, absorbed in the sultry deepness of a remembered summer, that I time traveled back to the 1964 World's Fair. My mom and dad were both teachers and had the summers off. And when the school bell rang adios to our mutual academic incarcerations, Dad would pack up the station wagon, he was a Ford man, and took us to the Badlands or Crystal Caves or to a cottage on Lake Erie with a name like Contentment or Bluebell's Rest or Excelsior. And in 1964, it was hi-yo silver and away from our rural sylvan glades and bosky dells in the state that is round on the ends and high in the middle, Ohio, and across the Pennsylvania Turnpike to Flushing Meadows and the fair. I actually remember I went with some reluctance. I was resentful that I would miss The Fugitive that week. It was summertime. Ronald Reagan's last movie, The Killers, was in theaters, the one where he smacks around Angie Dickinson. The Supremes were on the radio singing, "Where Did Our Love Go?" The papers still called black people Negroes. Negroes were rioting in Harlem that summer. We took the subway from downtown New York City.
That's my mom, and my sister, Annie, and me and my brother, Dick. Dad is taking the picture. My assignment was the movie camera. It was a Bell & Howell Zoomatic, exactly like the one operated the previous November in Dallas by Abraham Zapruder. Haven't gotten up the ambition to digitize the 8mm yet, but should my life be long, it'll likely get done. By the way, the front page of the newspaper I'm reading shows Jackie Kennedy debarking a plane, or do you say deplaning? And the headline refers to the widow Kennedy flying the previous day from Washington to New York to buy a Manhattan Fifth Avenue apartment to escape the tourists loitering outside her home in Georgetown. And searching that arrival event on the internet places the date of this newspaper and the photograph of me holding it squarely on July 29, 1964, the day after Jackie Kennedy's 35th birthday. My brother's birthday was actually going to be the next day, on July 30th, so he was 12 here the day before he became a teenager. This is me, Dave. David to my teachers, Davy to my sister, Davy Gravy to my grandmother, who conferred the title at some forgotten Thanksgiving. In 1964, I was a sophomore at Canfield High School, home to the Canfield Fighting Cardinals, and I was attitudinally and intellectually predisposed to be sophomoric. Ironic to think that of the two individuals in this image, I imagine myself the better dressed. We were Buckeyes by birth and by disposition. Not entirely backwoods yokels, but far from cosmopolitan. And we had prepared ourselves to see amazing marvels unknown in our bucolic habitat. And I found nothing odd about a replica of the Mormon Salt Lake Temple rising beside the Festival of Gas Pavilion. I was inclined to allow as how whatever was created for us to see must have had a darn good reason for being here, or it wouldn't have been built. This is my mom, Marge, and Dick and Annie in front of the thing that everybody got their picture taken in front of, that was destroyed in Men in Black when an alien spaceship crashed into it. It was also in Iron Man 2. And the first season of Amazing Race ended here. But of course, those things were eons away in our amazing future. And this is my cousin Doug, my Aunt Emmy Lou, and my Uncle John, the Rileys, taking their turn. And I assume John Riley was given the camera here because this is the only photograph in the bunch of the totality of my nuclear family. And nuclear was a theme here because it was the epoch of our friend the atom, who would provide us all with clean, safe, and cheap nuclear energy into our astounding future. as explained in the GE exhibit called Progress Land, where you have to give Walt Disney a high five for having been game enough to try to explain how thermonuclear fusion works by squeezing a deuterium plasma at 20 million degrees to create free energy to an audience that had made 1964's highest-rated TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies. And the Carousel of Progress Theater revolved on a turntable to display the historical march of electrical appliances, where electrical people spoke of electrical marvels to come in our George Jetson future. When Isaac Asimov visited this GE Pavilion, he wrote about what we could expect at the 2014 World's Fair, 50 years off, and he predicted the hit of the GE exhibit in 2014 would be a life-size 3D TV displaying a ballet. In between digesting the many educational experiences in the Walt Disney curriculum, we took time outs at the dining experiences available in the international area, where a 60s version of Epcot offered the Moroccan Cafe, where kids could get a hamburger, and the Jordanian Pavilion, where kids could get a hamburger. This is Dick in 1964 eating at the Townhouse restaurant run by Rheingold Beer. This is Dick in 2014, being celebrated as the Boca Raton, Florida Businessman of the Year at the Boca Raton Resort and Club. Here at the Parker Pen Pavilion, the idea was to achieve world peace by punch card computer matching people with pen pals around the world paired by common interest. And in my case, the result was an exchange of messages with a girl from Denmark, after which followed many years of correspondence between us, leading to the inevitable day, years later, when I asked her to be my wife. Which really happened, never, but I'm sure it happened, never. I spent considerable time contemplating this image and trying to understand this picture and why it was taken, and I eventually concluded that the answer to that question has been left behind and remains in 1964. I do suspect that the explanation is simple, that we were hayseeds and had never seen a dumpster, and we were drawn to it like the ape to the monolith in Space Odyssey. Any 10-year-old kid in this bunch is 60, and Pluto is drawing Social Security, and also 50 years older is the attraction that has people lined up beside the Tower of the Four Winds at the UNICEF exhibit. They're all waiting to get into the big building next door. And 8 out of 10 people on planet Earth will recognize even these fuzzy, unfocused images as having been taken inside the Pepsi Pavilion at the Disney It's a Small World boat ride. If I had not committed the melody to memory over the course of the ride, my sister's relentless repetition of it on the ride home over the Pennsylvania Turnpike tattooed it permanently into my cerebral cortex by the time we reached the Breezewood exit. That's the Kodak building behind Annie. This was the Freemasons Pavilion, which exhibited documents owned by George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who were Freemasons. And this would be a natural starting point for a time-traveling Nicolas Cage should somebody finally greenlight National Treasure 3. Here, my family gives it a rest, which I will likewise do with my narrative, because not every picture is worth 1,000 words, apart from saying these next views are from one of the gondolas on the Swiss Sky Ride. This spiky thing on top of a long pole sticking out of a bronzish sort of bubble is called the solar fountain. I guess the spikes are rays of the sun. I know nothing more about it, aside from that either my dad or I imagined it sufficiently photogenic to pose Cousin Doug in front of it twice. This show is called The Wonderful World of Chemistry, which was not my personal reality as reflected by my report card in that subject, but I'll bet I would have done better in Miss Burgoyne's chemistry lab if my school presented it as a Broadway musical with show-stopping dance numbers, which is what they did at the DuPont Pavilion. Here, there were real-life dancers and singers singing and dancing with projected film singers and dancers. Not a Michael Jackson hologram, maybe, but superior entertainment in 1964. And after the musical, the audience was funneled into the Fun with Chemistry experiment exhibit, where we learned things, such as that DuPont saved all our grocery meats from flies by inventing cellophane, and that DuPont has seen the future of fashion, and that future is polyester and spandex. These guys did tricks with science to demonstrate how the future would be way more fun when we all had our own tubs of liquid nitrogen in which to dip our croquet balls. And interestingly, one of the actors in this exhibit, if you look very closely at the figure in the center, would go on 10 years later to a featured supporting role in Godfather 2. That's right, Robert Duvall. And yes, there it is, what we were promised in 1964. An empty promise, the bitter taste of which still lingers, but as God is my witness, before I assume my inevitable role as compost, I will have a flying car. Oh yes, it will be mine. And some of you bought that Robert Duvall thing, totally, right? You know you did. And in the Ford Pavilion, you rode in a new Ford while looking at our wonderful future out the windows of this passageway. Disney designed it. It was called the Magic Skyway, biggest attraction at the fair. Could be a Galaxy 500, looks like one. 4 years later, my dad gave me one of these used. My first and favorite car, 1964 Ford Galaxy 500 convertible. Same color as this one. My dad was a Ford man, in the blood. From your convertible, you could see panoramic views of the World's Fair, and then you drove inside to the main exhibit hall, where from your late model Ford, you witnessed dinosaurs fighting. And there were audio animatronic cavemen, too. Walt Disney couldn't make enough robots in 1964. That's my mom with that Ford down there. She liked Fords, too. Partial to the Mercury Park Lane. Too fuzzy to tell if this is a park lane. Didn't have a high enough ASA to do low light very well. People under 30 don't know what that is. ASA? Wikipedia. U.S. Rubber put up a sign on the lower left there that says, U.S. Royal Giant Tire. You know, I think if the sign wasn't there, people would still get it. I'll bet you're with me on this. It says U.S. Rubber on the hubcap, but the tire U.S. Rubber made was the Uniroyal. Genius concept of American ingenuity. The Ferris wheel car tire. You could see the Manhattan skyline from the top. I have photographic proof I rode the world's largest tire. Got that going for me. My Uncle John and my cousin Doug taking a siesta at the General Motors Pavilion. This is Doug now. Remember when the Marshall College football team died in a plane crash? It was very sad. My Uncle John was one of the new coaches who rebuilt the football program. We Are Marshall, good movie. In the movie, Uncle John's pretend assistant coach character worked with these guys. Sadly, Uncle John is gone, as are Mom and Dad, and Annie too. But in 1964, here we all were, celebrating the glorious future. Except here at the Illinois Pavilion, where they were celebrating the past and Abraham Lincoln, who some say moved to Illinois after learning his name was on all the license plates. The Illinois Pavilion had Walt Disney's first audio animatronic President Lincoln. His voice was the actor who was the ghost of Jacob Marley in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol. 1964. Half a century later, this is still the car of the future, don't you think? Here are pictures from high up on the observation tower at the New York State Pavilion. In the Tower of Light, which was the electric power and light exhibit pavilion built by investor-owned power companies all across the country, Ben the Light Bulb and Sam the Eagle explain how the comforts of electrical power are given freely to the American people through the benevolence of the free enterprise system, which works best in a laissez-faire economic environment free from government regulation. If I remember my Ben the Bulb and Sam the Eagle manifesto. And I think I do. In my family, this is the slide that announces that the slideshow has come to an end, because it's the last slide on the roll of slide film that comes off the spindle and doesn't quite leave enough sprockets for the advance the film crank to move forward to the place it could have taken another whole picture. And so it is partly double exposed. Every one of my family slideshows ends with a picture like this. I wondered why Dad didn't just throw these away. But it was just as effective a pronouncement the slideshow was over as the script "The End" in the old Vitaphone movies. Yes, in 1964, the World's Fair promised us a bright and exciting future. And in the short term, it certainly was for me, because 2 months later, in my future, my new favorite TV show, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., premiered. And in the long term, it was for David McCallum, because it's 50 years later, and he's still on the #1 show. And so we left Flushing Meadows in the fullness of our conviction we would experience the fulfillment of technology's promise. The promise of picture phones, the promise of TV screens that would be even larger than the 25-inch rectangular picture tube RCA had just debuted in 1964. And wouldn't it be great if somebody could someday make a way to save The Fugitive while you were at the World's Fair so you could play it when you got home? And sometimes, in dreams, I am back, gliding on the Ford Magic Skyway, where we rode a Ford all the way into the future to the city of tomorrow. And we didn't know then what we know now, which is that the city of tomorrow would actually be built with all its soaring spires and bubble dome buildings, and that people live there right now. They call it Dubai.